Isaiah chapter 53, the prophet Isaiah speaking of the death of the Lord Jesus Christ 700 years before it happened. Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 3, "He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth." That passage is quoted by Matthew. We're looking at Matthew chapter 8 and verse 14. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all who were ill. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. How do we know that heaven is perfect? At Remembrance Sunday, we remember war with the associated sickness and suffering and mental scarring. How do we know that there will be none of these things in heaven? How do we know? Jesus said his heaven will be perfect. Revelation 21 comes to my mind. No weeping, no mourning, no pain. But our doubtful friends say, no, just because some man 2,000 years ago said it doesn't mean that it's true. And we say, well, he wasn't any old man, he was the Son of God. At Matthew 5, 6, 7, we've heard him teach like no other man. Matthew 8, we've seen him transform impossibly devastated lives like no other man. In all of these chapters, Jesus has demonstrated his divine authority and credentials. And then our friend asks the question that makes us squirm. So if God's heaven is perfect, why isn't the earth he created perfect? If Jesus has such authority, why doesn't he eliminate war and suffering and viruses now? At verse 14, it seems that disciple Peter is married and has a mother-in-law. She's very ill. Some scholars think it might be malaria. Just as before the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 4, Jesus taught, Jesus proclaimed, Jesus healed. Now after the sermon, the leper, the centurion's servant, now Peter's wife's mum, because of his compassion, Jesus heals instantly and completely. And we can see that Jesus, in performing these healings, is giving us a preview, a foretaste, an appetizer of what heaven is going to be like. We see Jesus' compassion, we see his power, we see him sorting individuals' lives. Verse 16, we see him destroying seemingly every type of affliction. But the nagging question at the back of our minds, why didn't he go the whole hog? Why didn't he, once and for all, obliterate all suffering for all people? If that is what he is eventually going to do, then why didn't he do it back then? Why is suffering still everywhere? What are we missing in our understanding? Unexpectedly, Matthew takes us back 700 years to Isaiah, who was writing about the Messiah to come. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases, Isaiah 53:4. But when Isaiah wrote, he took up our sicknesses, he didn't merely mean he took away our sicknesses, rather he took onto himself our sicknesses. The Messiah, said Isaiah, would not just take people's sicknesses away, he would take them onto himself. And we think, what? Jesus took the leper's leprosy onto himself? Jesus became a leper? No, he didn't. Jesus took the mother-in-law's fever onto himself. He got malaria in her place. No, he didn't. I look at Isaiah's words applied to Jesus and I'm confused. And when I look back at Isaiah 53, presumably Matthew intends me to do that, I become even more confused. Because Isaiah 53 is not about the Messiah taking away physical or medical sickness. Isaiah 53 is about the Messiah who would come to take the penalty for our sin, who would deal not just with my medical sickness, but my spiritual sickness. Isaiah 53, let me read it again. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. So striking, isn't it? Isaiah describing the cross of Christ 700 years before it happened. And so striking that in the middle of these stories of Jesus' healing, Matthew wants to take us to the cross. Something has dawned on me these past few weeks as I've been puzzling my way through this passage. I knew that Jesus' of healing of people was him showing us what heaven will be like, that it will be made up entirely of healed people. I knew that. But what I hadn't seen before is that Jesus was only able to heal people because of the work he was going to do on the cross. That's why Matthew quotes Isaiah. He's telling us that Jesus could heal people only because of what he was going to do on the cross. Cast your minds back to the Garden of Eden. There was no suffering, there was no sickness, there was no death. There was also no sin. It was only after mankind had decided that their way of doing things was better than God's that suffering, sickness, death came into the world. Sin is the underlying cause of every misery, and so to remove every misery, you need to remove underlying sin. Just let's explore that for a second so we're convinced. Most suffering is obviously and directly caused by sin. Why is there war? Greed for power and control and wealth is almost always there. Why is there famine? Well, the same reason, given the United Nations repeatedly assuring us that there is enough food to go round. If we loved God with every fibre of our being, if we loved our neighbours as we love ourselves, there would be no war, there would be no famine. Sickness. Yes, some sickness you can also directly link to sin. I get tested coronavirus positive, I refuse to self-isolate, I give it to you. My sin has caused your sickness. Or I decide to sleep my way around Stoke-on-Trent, I pick up an STD. My sin has caused my sickness. Some sickness there is a direct link. But other sicknesses, there isn't that obvious and direct link between sin and sickness. There's no hint of a direct link with Peter's mother-in-law. Just as with many so-called natural disasters, there is no clear and obvious direct link between sin and suffering. But the Bible tells us that in a way that we can't quite grasp, Sinful people not only mess up their own lives and those of other people, they also mess up the planet and the way the planet works. Before there was sin in the world, there was no suffering, no death. But now we have the sin gene in our DNA. Suffering and death are everywhere. And so what has God done? What is the story of the Bible? What is what we call the gospel? He has come in the person of Jesus to remove the underlying problem, to eradicate sin completely by dying on the cross. On the cross, for those that want sin obliterated from their lives, for those that want to love him and his ways entirely, Jesus takes our sin DNA, our messing things up DNA, and he swaps it for his own selfless, sacrificial, generous, big-hearted DNA. Jesus dies, but his followers live forever. And the heaven the Lord Jesus Christ is creating and filling will be perfect, but only because he is taking away the sin of each of its future inhabitants one by one. There's no hint that Peter's mother-in-law had caused her own suffering, or it had been deliberately caused by someone else, but she was still the sort of person who thought her way of living was better than God's. Well, we all are like that. She was living in a sinful world. We all do. Jesus was able to heal her because he was shortly to go to the cross and do his work of eradicating sin and therefore sickness from the world. Peter's wife's mum experienced in advance a glimpse of the permanent healing that all followers of Jesus will one day experience in heaven. She experienced in advance the benefits of Jesus' sin-eradicating death. The question I asked earlier, why didn't Jesus heal everyone everywhere back in Matthew 8? Because he had to first die on the cross. Why does he not heal everyone everywhere now he has died on the cross? Because the gift of the work he did on the cross needs claiming by each of us one by one. God does not force us to fall in love with his son Jesus, but those of us who do, he takes our sinful DNA onto himself. He gives us his selfless, sacrificial, generous, big-hearted DNA. And slowly that DNA changes us. Follower of Jesus, one day you will die. It might be COVID, but immediately you will be in paradise. And one day this world will finally end, and there will then be established a new heaven and new earth with no crying, no mourning, no pain. The perfect new creation. Do you know that is for you? Right now, are you certain that is for you? Is this the moment for you again to surrender your life to the Lord Jesus, to resolve to know him more and to make him known more? Cry to him again. And the medical miracle he did for Peter's wife's mum will be a faint shadow of what he will do for you. Cry to him again.